welcome Aijazuddin, our good friend of the Museum Society of Mumbai. This will be the third lecture that you will be presenting to us in this wonderful series, and we are very, very grateful for this honor. And I welcome you on behalf of the chairman and the trustees of the Prince of CSMVS, on behalf of Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, the Director General, and the staff of the museum, and of course on our own behalf at the Museum Society, my committee members, and we have lots of guests with us this evening. So welcome to our guests and welcome to you, Aijaz, and to Shanaz for joining us this evening. Mrs. Aijazuddin is an author in her own right, and I'm delighted that you've had the time to join us. Just a few words about Mr. Aijazuddin. A wonderful scholar with a very, very diverse background. He's a Pakistani. He styles himself in his retirement as a Pakistani art historian. He has written 22 books on subjects as diverse as Pahari miniature painting. We were lucky to hear that. Sikh history and portraiture, we heard that too from the Lahore Museum. Rare maps of Pakistan, the history of Lahore from 1800 to 1947. And now here are the surprises. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China in July 1971. Pakistan-US relations during the presidency of Richard Nixon, and more recently, a popular biography of his ancestors, Aijazuddin's family, 3 Muslim brothers known as the Fakirs, who served at the Sikh court of Lahore during the 19th century. Of course, his forte is artworks of 19th century India. He's lectured, as I said, 3 times and I think twice earlier, pre-COVID times. And his latest lecture is Sketches from the Howdah, self-explanatory, draws on the watercolors and journal notes made by Charlotte Lady Canning on 3 tours she made in India between 1858 and 1861. Mr. Aijazuddin lives in Lahore, so he's addressing us from there this evening. So thank you very much. What are we going to hear this evening? Lady Canning was modest and a self-effacing consort of the first Viceroy, Lord Canning. And she was really much more than just the dutiful wife. She was a very gifted watercolorist and a shrewd observer of the social and political scene of India in the late 1850s. Before leaving for India with her husband, she had served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria for 13 years. During her stay in India between 1856 and 1861, the year of her very untimely death, she made a number of tours across the country. Throughout them, she maintained a journal describing the sights she passed through and supplemented her recollection of them with watercolor sketches of really incredible sensitivity. Her perspective and lively accounts of the often hazardous journeys she undertook across northern India, as far as the fabled Khyber Pass, into the Himalayas, her trek to Chini, and sojourn in central India deserve a wider audience worthy of her intrepid endeavors. I cannot help but remember our dear friend, Pauline Rohatgi. She passed away 2 years ago, right at the beginning of COVID. There were no vaccines, there was nothing 24 months earlier. We really miss Pauline, and I'm glad we're doing this lecture because you knew Pauline as well and you knew of her scholarship. So thank you so much during International Museum Week that we have the pleasure of your company and your erudition in addressing us. So technical team, a big round of applause to you, ably led by Jason Johns, Yashraj, Aishwarya, and Mrinalini. And I would also like to thank at this stage my colleague, Professor Dr. Anita Rane Kothari, who you'll be hearing at the end, conducting the question and answer session, and giving the vote of thanks. So thank you so much, Aijaz. We greatly appreciate this. And now I hand you over to our very able technical team to take the evening forward. Sit back and enjoy this wonderful, sensitive journey of Lady Canning's watercolors. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to thank my very dear friend, Firoza Godrej, for her generous introduction and the invitation to speak to you through the Museum Society of Bombay and the museum in Bombay itself. This is the third lecture, as she mentioned, that I've been giving, and I'm gratified that there should be a continuing interest in whatever I have to say and in the various books that I have written. I'm also indebted to her team, especially Mr. Jason Johns, for his technical advice. The topic of my lecture today is going to be on Charlotte Lady Canning. And as Firoza has just mentioned, the 3 tours that she undertook during her stay in India between 1858 and 1861. Well, who was Lady Charlotte Lady Canning? A member of the British aristocracy, most of her earlier life had been spent at Queen Victoria's court and her final years in India. This portrait of her, done in 1849 by Queen Victoria's favorite painter, Franz Winterhalter, was commissioned by Queen Victoria, and it shows Lady Canning, in a sense, in the bloom of the early middle age. Let me give you a brief chronology of what was to become a very brief life. She was born in 1817. She was married at the age of 18, was spent 13 years at court between 1842 and 55, and then accompanied her husband to India in 1856. The tours that I will be dealing with cover the years 1858 until her untimely death in 1861. She died in November 1861.
Yes.
She was the elder daughter of Elizabeth Lady Stuart de Rothsay and her husband, Lord de Rothsay, who, by the way, was the ambassador, UK British ambassador to France, and they lived for a long while in Paris. All of them were very accomplished, and particularly the younger daughter, Louisa, who was an accomplished watercolorist, as was the elder sister, Charlotte. And after Charlotte went to India, she maintained a continuous stream of correspondence with her mother, her sister, and various other people, including Queen Victoria. At the age of 18, she fell in love with Lord Canning, Charles Canning. He was an up-and-coming politician, and he was elected as an MP, inherited a peerage, and then had to move to the House of Lords. He was appointed Governor General and left for India in December 1855. There was a whiff of a rumor that he had had an affair. And in those days, if you had an affair, you were exiled and became Governor General of India. Lady Canning had little choice but to accompany her husband, following him dutifully, as she put it rather indelicately, like a dog. Before she left for India, Charlotte had served Queen Victoria as her lady-in-waiting for 13 years. Being childless was an advantage of sorts, so she spent more time at court than with her husband. She's shown here in attendance with Queen Victoria and her family, visiting the troops wounded in the Crimean War. I was introduced to Lady Canning through Charles Allen's wonderful biography of her, A Glimpse of the Burning Plain. I drew from her extensive letters from India, the journals she maintained during her various trips, and a collection of her watercolors. The bulk of these watercolors are maintained at Harwood House in Leeds, and they were inherited by the present Lord Harwood, who very generously provided me access to them and reproduction facilities. I'm deeply grateful to him, and I was hoping that he'd be able to join us, but I will be sending a recording of this to him. I spoke to him yesterday, and we had a long chat about the quality of her work. In fact, when I'd written my book and I sent it to him for the foreword, he read it. It's about 340 pages. He read it, was delighted with the outcome. And then, rather teasingly, he said, I have a feeling that by the end of the book, you're a little in love with Lady Canning. I said, it's inevitable when you're living with somebody for so long and going through their life, you do become attached in a way to the subject of the biography. But it was a kind of perceptive remark. And I hope by the end of this lecture, you will be enamored of her, if not a little in love with Lady Canning. The bulk of these watercolors were inherited, as I've said, by Lord Harwood, and they kept in albums and catalogued according to years. These include scenes of natural history drawings, such as these, and you can see that she had a flair for color as well as for composition. They included views of Egypt and Indian scenes. Two other albums were maintained by the Victorian Albert Museum, as I discovered. And these complemented many of the ones that were in the Harwood collection. So I discovered, to my surprise and delight, that the drawings in one would be complemented by the finished watercolor in the Harwood collection, and vice versa. Throughout her stay in India, Lady Canning maintained a stream of correspondence with Queen Victoria. These letters were stored by the Queen in the archives at Windsor Castle, in the Round Tower, which many of you may be familiar with. And it was a chore, but a delightful one, to have to climb the 100 steps to reach the top, where scholars can access these royal archives. Lady Canning's handwriting was swift, and like most Victorian writers, was often difficult and challenging to decipher. But here you can see the title, the phrase from which Charles Allen took his title, which was, I have a glimpse of the burning plain, but enough to remind me of what I've left behind. Lady Canning's diaries are maintained at the British Library, and there are 2 volumes of them covering 1856 until 1861, and they are full, replete with detailed accounts of all of the places that she visited, amplified by interesting drawings that she included. For example, the one on the bottom is of different kinds of palm trees that she saw. Queen Victoria, Lady Canning, left for India in December 1856. En route, they toured the sites in Egypt. For example, the temple at Edfu and the magnificent ruins of the Ramesseum near Luxor. Her quick sketches were a kind of aid memoir for her to develop into more detailed watercolors. While it would have been tempting to have tried a definitive book on all Lady Canning's drawings and watercolors, I had to limit myself to the 3 trips she made within India, to Mysore and Kannur, from Kolkata to the Khyber Pass, and the detour later to Chennai, and then her final tour to central India. Lady Canning used a variety of modes of transport, sometimes on a caparisoned elephant, and you can see the ladder which enabled her to climb into the Howdah. She would ride, side saddle, or in the Punjab, she enjoyed the dubious comfort of a camel-drawn carriage, which enabled her to stretch out should she have to make an overnight journey. In the absence of other forms that she found intriguing enough to illustrate in detail in her journal were the palki, the tonjan, the doli, and in each case, for the purposes of her family's interest, she made sketches of them and sent these back to her mother and her sister in the United Kingdom. When, during the tour, they had to cross bridges, rivers were crossed using rafts made by mushks or bloated animals' hides. Throughout her journeys, Lady Canning maintained a sketchbook. From time to time, she developed her sketches into larger watercolors, which periodically she then sent back to her family in the UK. Some of the sketches she did sitting, as the title of my book suggests, sitting in the Howdah and looking down on India. The Cannings led a life of breezy luxury at Calcutta. They left it for the first of their journeys, traveling to the Nilgiri Hills and Kannur in April 1858. In the cooler, verdant heights, Charlotte made a number of sketches of the beautiful scenery surrounding her, and it was a great change from the heat of Calcutta. One of the distractions would have been to have breakfast outdoors, preferably in a shaded grove, and of course, a palette and paper were at hand to record the scene. On the way back, she stopped at Seringapatam to see the palace of Tipu Sultan. And a more doleful location was a promontory known as Tipu's Drop, Nandi Drug. It was from the heights of Kannur that Charlotte made this watercolor, which showed the burning plains below. Using her pen as she would have a palette, she described it as a blue sea with islands, and here and there, streaks of pink and blue and yellow, all melted together like the colors of an opal. In July 1858, the Cannings undertook a tour to Allahabad and Varanasi. The journey began on the Governor General's yacht, Sunamukhi, a paddle steamer. The Cannings lived on the main ship. At night, they retired to the cabins below, after which the menial staff, which numbered about 200, would sleep on the same deck. They traveled on it from Kolkata to Allahabad. At Allahabad's governor's house, they had a chance of organizing themselves for a longer tour. And a tour of this magnitude, over 600 miles, involving thousands of staff and liveried retainers, had certain logistical challenges. One of them was how to arrange darbars. The darbar, such as this one at Fatehgarh, was held en route. Loyal princes, and we are talking about a post-1857 situation in India, loyal princes were rewarded and opponents were chastised, often publicly. In 1858, December, the Cannings had reached Varanasi, where Charlotte made this picture of the temples and the burning ghats. Lady Charlotte was sensitive to everything around her, especially phenomena such as the Donati comet, which passed Earth in October 1858. It had a tail 33 miles long and remained visible for almost a fortnight. If you live long enough, you should be able to see Donati's comet on its way back in September 3808. That's 1800 years from now. The following year, the Cannings took an ambitious tour of northern India. It took them to the northernmost extremity, the fabled Khyber Pass. The exhausting venture was as much to allow Canning familiarity with the states of country as an assertion of British supremacy after the bloody events of 1857. Lucknow was an emotive association for the British. Interestingly, Lady Canning made no pictures of the sites which figured prominently in the accounts of 1857. However, she did cover many of these incidents in her private correspondence with Queen Victoria. She painted instead the anodyne La Martiniere School and the famous Imam Barga, built by Asfatullah Daulah, Nawab of Awadh in 1784. The Cannings held the first of their upcountry darbars at Lucknow on the 2nd of November. Charlotte gave an amusing account of it to Queen Victoria, and in her letter she mentions the very mysterious terror that affected the taluktars, who thought that the ceremonial guns that were being fired were actually intended for them. By the end of November, the Cannings had reached Agra and had their first glimpse of Shah Jahan's magnificent Taj Mahal. Lady Canning used the 12 days that they had in Agra to paint its famous sights. And obviously, the main tomb built for Mumtaz Mahal by her grieving husband, Shah Jahan, and the nearby desolated city of Fatehpur Sikri with its imposing Buland Darwaza. Within Fatehpur Sikri lay the discarded red sandstone imperial ambitions of the Emperor Akbar, lying vacant. In Milton's words, vain monument of strength. Later that December, the Cannings visited the small state of Deeg near Bharatpur. Charlotte sketched the picturesque marble palace reflected in the shimmering pool. Another sight that caught her fancy was the Hoodie Tank at Govardhan between Mathura and Bharatpur. She described it as peopled with green parrots and doves, besides with peacock, with apes and turtles. And it was on a march from Deeg the disaster struck. Lady Canning's tent caught fire during the night of 11th of December, and she, of course, immediately did a quick sketch of it. And although she has personally escaped, many of her paintings and journal were badly scorched. She regretted particularly the letters Queen Victoria had written to her and which she carried with her wherever she went. They were charred at the edges, but still, nevertheless, legible. By Christmas 1859, the Cannings had reached Hardwar, and this is one of a number of sketches she did of the temples there. The Cannings welcomed the new year, 1860, in the Mughal capital of Delhi. Lady Canning's brush went into overdrive as she painted every major monument of the city. She thought the Chandni Chowk, though, was a disappointment. She spent some time in the area around Qutb Minar. After making it, as she put it, unsatisfactory sketches, she commented, all this kind of thing requires correct detail and perhaps is best for photography. Close to the Qutb Minar, she visited a well, a popular tourist spot where young men would leap into its 70-foot depth to retrieve coins thrown by visitors. Lady Canning included a drawing of it in her journal and then developed it into the larger monochrome sketch that you see on the right for her album. The Darbar for the Punjab chiefs was held at Ambala in January 1860. Prominent amongst them were the rulers of Patiala, Nabha, and Jind, each competing with the other for pomp and for precedence. The painting of the scene at Ambala was done by George Landseer, who had joined Lady Canning's party. Another British artist who had become part of the Canning entourage was William Simpson, the Illustrated London News correspondent. Lady Canning admitted that she could not draw human figures, and therefore she relied upon William Simpson to record the spectacular impression of the Ambala Darbar, which was held on the 19th of January, 1860. Reaching the Punjab, the Cannings crossed the Satluj, once the boundary between the Sikh Empire and British possessions. The Canning party stopped en route at Kartarpur, the last resting place of Guru Nanak Ji. There, they were allowed darshan of the earliest known copy of the Guru Granth Sahib. The original site was in what is now Pakistan, and it was only when there was an inundation feared from the river Ravi, in fact, which occurred, that the Hoodie Granth was then moved to its present site, which is now in India, and so the site had been vacated. So the present Kartarpur renovations that have taken place on the Pakistani side are on the location that you see here. This particular Gurdwara, I think, was demolished over the years. The party then entered the holy city of Amritsar in the first week of February 1860. Lady Canning sketched the entrance of the Rambagh Summer Palace, which is a favorite of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The principal attraction, though, of course, was Harmandir Sahib. Lady Canning sketched it during the day and returned at night to see a firework display reflected in the sacred pool. Amritsar was a march away from Lahore. The Cannings camped near Shalimar Gardens outside Lahore, where Charlotte spent all day, as she said, painting up my sketches, for my arrears are terrible. They entered Lahore on the 11th of February in a grand manner. She recorded, "This public entry into Lahore has been the thoughts and plans of all the authorities here for weeks past." She added, they were as cruel, though, as to the length of it. She found the city far beyond her expectations. Her sketch from the roof of the Sheesh Mahal in the Lahore fort caught the admixture of Mughal, Sikh, and British monuments. One can see Aurangzeb's majestic Badshahi Mosque, Ranjit Singh's Samadhi, white Samadhi on the right, and his white marble pavilion in the Huzuri Bagh on the left, and in the foreground, the barracks built by the British forces in occupation. Across the river Ravi lay the tomb of the Emperor Jahangir and his wife Nur Jahan. Lady Canning's sketch is of Jahangir's tomb and does not include the grave of Nur Jahan. Today, both the imperial couple are divided by a railway line. The Cannings stayed in Lahore for over a week. They left Peshawar on the 19th of February. The first leg of their journey required them to travel 73 miles non-stop, from 6 in the morning till 12 at night. And this was made partially tolerable by the camel-drawn carriage, which permitted the occupant to stretch out at night. Relays of camels were made available en route, and whenever they stopped, Lady Canning would do a quick sketch. When they reached Peshawar, Lady Canning did this sketch of the city of Peshawar from the fort. She described the scene as magnificent. On the left, you can see the mosque, famous mosque of Muhammad Khan. On the 25th of February, 1860, she rode to a point as close as she could get to the fabled Khyber Pass. She wrote in her diary, "I got upon an elephant to make a sketch of it a quarter of a mile off. The foreground of horsemen, irregulars, and mounted police in yellow sheepskin coats made a beautiful picture. I'm so glad to have seen this striking outpost, an extreme boundary of India. It is the grandest defense the country ever had." Returning, they crossed the river Indus at Ettak. Lady Canning was asked to inaugurate a tunnel beneath the river. It proved difficult to complete and was later replaced by an overhead bridge. On the way back, the Cannings stopped at the ruins of Rohtas Fort, built by Sher Shah Suri near the Jhelum. Although they spent less than half a day there, Lady Canning was totally entranced by what she saw. Her diary entry reads, "The fort looks like an ogre's castle in a fairy tale book, with massive towers and walls with high round battlements. The distance of blue mountains and snow and the sandy river behind these ruins made endless pictures. In fact, Lady Canning made 5 in all during that brief morning that she spent at Rohtas. To check the accuracy of her observation, I visited Rohtas Fort myself some years ago. And this is her watercolor sketch of the tower known as the Rani Mahal. And here is my photograph of it. So you can see that the fidelity was considerable. The next stage of the Cannings' journey took them into the Punjab hill states. Here is a view, the first view that she had of Kot Kangra, the hill fort belonging to Maharaja Sansar Chand of Kangra. prominent amongst them, of course, of the hill states was Kangra, and she did sketch what had been regarded as impregnable until the Gurkhas laid siege to it in 1806. Raja Sansarchand of Kangra held them at bay as best he could for 3 years because the fort had a private supply of water, and you can see the water being carried up on the right-hand side. Intrigued on the way back by the monuments to Satis near Jawalmukhi, Lady Canning stopped to make a quick sketch of them. On the 28th of March, the Cannings were taken to the temple of Jawalmukhi. This was a temple to Devi because there was a fissure in the rock from which gas emerged, and it was lit and was regarded as fire emanating from the mouth of the Devi. Lord Canning was so taken up by this particular picture that he asked, unusually, Lady Canning to do another version, a more complete one, for him. The return journey to Shimla required them to cross the river Beas on mushroks. And you can see the Cannings are seated on chairs in the middle of the picture, balanced on a makeshift raft. It was a precarious way to travel, but unavoidable. At Shimla, Charles decided that he needed to return to Calcutta. He encouraged Lady Charlotte, though, to continue her journey into the Himalayan foothills with a smaller party. Impressed by the magnificent deodars, she did a number of picture paintings of them. This is one of them. They achieved considerable height and were quite spectacular both to see and to paint. Lady Canning and her now diminished escort spent the next 2 months traveling to the Rupin Pass as far as Chini. The route involved going along a wooden track carved out of the cliff face. And one gets an idea of the mountains and the scale of the mountains that she had to travel through from this drawing that she did. And minutely, you can see these ant-like figures, which in fact of the advance party, which is proceeding ahead of her. At the Wangtu Bridge, swung across the Sutlej, arrangements were made for a meal at the river's edge. The party stopped whenever they could, and they would have, like most of these viceregal and important VIP parties, they would have 2 teams. One would travel ahead and then set up what were the eating and commissariat arrangements, and by the time the main party arrived, everything had been laid out and prepared for them. This is a camp, when they set up a camp on the left-hand side. It's near the temple at Chegaon, and here they stopped on the 1st of May, 1860, and of course, Lady Canning brings out her watercolor box and paper and does this rather nice sketch of it. A few days later, she reached Chini. And as she recorded, to view towards Chini is very fine. The whole valley opens out, and the great peaks of Ruldung Kailas rise at once from the Sutlej to 21,000 feet. It was a very dramatic picture, and she catches it in this rather wonderful watercolor. She braved the cold and the perilous rope bridges known as jhulas, this one across the Sutlej between Chini and Pwari. High on the Rupin Pass, at a height of 15,480 feet, Lady Canning finds the rock cairn. It's a Buddhist shrine, an offering to the gods. And the water at this height was frozen and had to be thawed to allow her to paint. This is one of my favorite pictures. One of the features of hill life that intrigued Lady Canning was the role played by women, who, rather than the men, acted as coolies. And although she confessed she could not paint human figures as accurately as she could natural scenery, her sketches of the hill women and their distinctive jewelry have a certain unaffected charm. Here are some details of jewelry worn by these hill women. By mid-June, she had reached Dharamshala and was back amongst the greenery she had enjoyed so much. She arrived in Mussoorie in mid-June 1860 in time to catch the monsoon rains. And this view, another view of Mussoorie, was done from the house known as the castle, which had once been occupied by the exiled Maharaja Duleep Singh. Lady Canning wrote, "It has a beautiful view over the large station of Mussoorie and looks up to the Landau Hill." Over the winter of 1860-61, the Cannings did a tour together of central India. Inevitably, that involved a trip to the famous Gola at Patna, which was designed as a grain storage, but in fact was rarely used for that. And another view, this time of the Nepalese temple at Varanasi. And the fort at Chunar, where the Sikh Maharani Jinnah was incarcerated for a while before she escaped to Nepal. On the journey from her vessel, Lady Canning noticed a small boat of snake charmers, one of whom showed off his two-headed snake. Nearby, Jabalpur was known for its white marble rocks, and the Cannings were duly taken there. And there, Lady Canning did a series of sketches of the dramatic natural formations. The little boat that you can see in the foreground, overshadowed by the rocks, it, in fact, contains Lady Canning and her party. This area was known for its tigers, and so obviously a shikar was arranged for Lord Canning and his party, but the ladies were required to sit in machans. Lady Canning, ever busy, whiled away her time in a machan, drawing the trees surrounding her. Lord Canning finally managed to bag a tiger. This watercolor, illustrating his success, was painted not by Lady Canning, but by a member of their staff, Sir Edward Campbell. Lady Canning's briefer sketch of another hunt is more perfunctory and amateurish by comparison. And here you can see the tiger being brought back to the camp. The waterfalls at nearby Rewa provide another opportunity for Lady Canning to sketch from a number of different angles. It was at this time, in February 1861, that at Lalganj, that the artist George Landseer caught up again with the Cannings. Lady Canning wrote to Queen Victoria, "Mr. Landseer begged me to sit for him for his picture of my elephant, so that I might find my place in the Howdah in the right proportion." This painting was formerly in the royal collection. King George V gave it to his daughter, Mary, Countess of Harwood, which is why it is now in the Harwood House collection at Leeds. When I saw this painting, Lord Harwood and I were chatting and trying to identify who the artist was, and suddenly the title of the book came to mind, Sketches from a Howdah. You can see Lady Canning in the Howdah with her sketch pad. Lady Canning returned to Kolkata, hoping to return to England, but her husband was asked to extend his stay a little longer. For her, it proved a fatal delay. She occupied herself with making natural history drawings of flowers and fruit that she thought might interest her family back home. But in one of the last letters she wrote to a friend, she mentioned that she had, as she put it, a little of the Purnia fever, which is rampant at this season. The years that Lady Canning spent in India took their toll. This is what she was like in 1849, and this is her 12 years later. Weakened and worn out, she succumbed to the fever. She died on the 18th of November and was buried before dawn in the garden at Barrackpore. One can still see the flowers that had once lain on her grave because they are preserved in a memorial album in the British Library. On the anniversary of her death, 4 years ago, when I was giving a lecture in Islamabad, I asked a friend of mine in Calcutta, a very dear friend, to lay some of her favorite flowers on her grave. He did so and sent me a picture, which I was able to include in the lecture, which was in fact on the day of her anniversary. Lord Canning returned to England a totally broken man. He never met Queen Victoria because Queen Victoria was in mourning for her own husband, Prince Albert, who died in December 1861. Lord Canning didn't survive for long. He died in the UK some months later. It would be invidious for me to have to choose which of her paintings, and hundreds of paintings, I find most appealing. One personal favorite of mine, though, is her view of my home city, Lahore, and of Shalimar Gardens. I find it a delightful picture that she did from the rooftop of the pavilion, which overlooked the various terraces of the Farabaksh and the Fezbaksh, for which Shalimar Gardens were famous. And here you can see the fountains in full play. It's a delightful, heartwarming picture. The second and final one with which I'll close is her glimpse at Kannur of the burning plains. This particular spot is now irreversibly associated with her, and it's called Lady Canning's Seat, and it is now demarcated as the place from which you have a spectacular view of the landscape which so entranced her. I hope you enjoyed these images of Lady Canning's watercolors, as I did while researching them with my wife, Shanaz. I believe they deserve recognition, not because they were by an under-occupied Memsah, a redundant relic of the British Raj, but because Lady Canning has left for all of us a priceless, delightful record of an India of princes, darbars, of its galaxy of people, its mountains, gardens, and glaciers. These watercolors and her descriptions of them have a spontaneity and an immediacy about them that no armchair modern television documentary can ever capture in the same way. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.